Moving to a new city is an exciting challenge, I thought as I looked at the pile of boxes in my empty apartment. I had just moved to Chicago, eager to start my new life as a financial analyst. The job was demanding, with long hours at the office, but the promising career was worth it. The only thing missing was furnishing the apartment, and my budget didn't allow for luxuries. While browsing Craiglist for cheap furniture, I found an ad that caught my attention. Antique furniture set, bargain price. There was a dining table, a sofa, and even a cabinet, all in great condition. The price was surprisingly low. Without a second thought, I messaged the seller and we arranged for me to visit his house that afternoon. The house was in a remote neighborhood, on a quiet, tree-lined street. Upon arrival, I was greeted by a middle-aged man with a common appearance, but something about his smile was unsettling. He led me to a room filled with antique furniture and strange objects. There were wooden masks, old pendulum clocks, and bizarre statuettes scattered everywhere. "You have good taste in decor," I commented, trying to break the ice. "Ah, I like things with history," he replied, looking at me in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The furniture I was interested in seemed to be in excellent condition, so I quickly closed the deal. He helped load everything into my car, and soon I was back in my apartment, eager to set everything up. As I arranged the furniture, I felt satisfied with my purchase. The apartment finally began to feel like a home. Little did I know that the real terror was just beginning. The first few days with the new furniture were uneventful. I spent most of my time at work, coming home only to sleep. However, whenever I was home, there was an unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if an invisible presence was watching me. One night, while relaxing on the sofa, I heard a faint crack coming from the cabinet. I ignored it, thinking it was just the wood adjusting to the temperature. But then, I started noticing other signs. Small noises during the night, like whispered footsteps on the wooden floor, and the strange sensation of being watched. One night, arriving home late from work, I noticed the cabinet door was ajar. I was sure I had closed it that morning. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to rationalize, blaming exhaustion and my overworked mind. Days later, while cleaning the living room, I found a small hole on the side of the cabinet, almost imperceptible. Looking closer, I realized it was a hidden camera. My heart raced. Who would do something like this? I immediately remembered the seller, that man with his unsettling smile. I turned over every piece of furniture I bought from him and, to my horror, found more hidden cameras in the sofa and dining table. The reality of what was happening began to sink in, and panic took hold of me. He was watching me. I ran to my bedroom, locked the door, and called the police, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. They promised to send a patrol immediately. While waiting, I remembered that the seller had all my information: my name, my address, my phone number. The sense of security in my own home evaporated, replaced by a paralyzing fear. The wait for the police to arrive seemed endless. Every second felt like a minute, every minute an eternity. I couldn't shake the image of the seller from my mind, his sinister smile now revealing much darker intentions. Finally, the doorbell rang, and I opened the door to two police officers. They conducted a thorough search of the apartment, finding all the hidden cameras I had discovered. As they inspected the furniture, one of the officers asked me a series of questions about the seller and the transaction. "Do you have any information about the man who sold you this furniture?" asked the officer with a serious expression. "I have his address," I replied, my voice still trembling. "I went to his house to see the furniture. They took down the information and promised to investigate. Meanwhile, they suggested I stay in a hotel until everything was resolved." I agreed readily. The thought of spending another night in that apartment terrified me. I spent the night in a cheap hotel, but sleep did not come easily. The thought that someone was watching my every move, possibly planning something worse, kept me on edge. The next morning, I received a call from the police. They had found the seller's house. What they discovered was even more disturbing than I could have imagined. The house was full of surveillance equipment, explained the officer. He has videos of several people, not just you. It seems he was obsessed with recording other people's lives without them knowing. Was he arrested? I asked, hoping to hear an answer that would bring me some relief. We haven't found him, said the officer, his voice somber. But we're looking for him. We advise you to stay vigilant and contact us if you notice anything suspicious. I hung up the phone, feeling trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. Going back to my apartment was out of the question, but I couldn't hide forever either. The following weeks were a blur of anxiety and fear. I moved from hotel to hotel trying to keep a low profile. It was one of those nights, while trying to fall asleep, that I heard a noise outside the hotel door. My heart raced, and I silently got up, approaching the door with caution. I peeked through the peephole and saw him. The seller was there, standing, staring intently at my room door. I took a step back, my body trembling with fear. I grabbed my phone and, with shaking hands, called the police again. They arrived quickly, but the seller had already disappeared into the night. After that incident, the police increased the security around me and finally managed to arrest the man a few weeks later. During his interrogation, he confessed that he placed cameras in the furniture he sold to monitor people's lives. He derived a sick pleasure from spying on and controlling his targets as if they were characters in a story he was writing. With the seller behind bars, the sense of relief was immense, but the psychological scars remained. I returned to my apartment, but I never felt completely safe again. Every creak of the wood, every shadow on the wall, reminded me that real terror is not just a story we read. It's something that can invade our daily lives, turning the familiar into a constant nightmare. I've known Lucas since we were kids. We grew up together, playing ball in the neighborhood field and exploring the neighborhood as if we were great adventurers. He always was the optimistic type, easily trusting those around him, while I was the more skeptical one, always looking over my shoulder. I used to say that Lucas was incredibly lucky never to have gotten into serious trouble, but that might be about to change. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when Lucas called me, excited about a great deal he found on Craiglist, a nearly new bike at an incredibly low price. You know this could be a scam, right? I warned, but he was confident. He arranged to meet the seller at a local park, a place we used to frequent as teenagers. I offered to go with him, but Lucas laughed, saying everything would be fine. It's a public park. There's nothing to worry about, he reassured me. Deep down, I wasn't convinced, but Lucas always was stubborn when it came to good opportunities. He promised to message me as soon as he got back with the new bike. That afternoon seemed to drag on. I found myself checking my phone every 5 minutes, waiting for any sign from him. Lucas had promised to call me as soon as he got to the park, but an hour passed with no contact. I started to feel a tightness in my chest, a feeling I knew all too well something was wrong. Hours passed and the anxiety took over. I decided to call Lucas, but the call went straight to voicemail. The feeling of worry grew, and my mind began to imagine terrible scenarios. Knowing he had mentioned the local park, I grabbed my keys and rushed there. When I arrived, the sun was starting to set, and the park seemed eerily deserted. I looked around, searching for any sign of Lucas or the seller. After a few minutes, I spotted a middle-aged man standing near one of the trails. I approached and asked if he had seen anyone testing a bike recently. "Ah, yes," "I saw a young man with a bright blue bike about an hour ago," said the man. "They went down that more secluded trail, near the woods." My stomach turned. Why would Lucas agree to go to such an isolated place? Without wasting any time, I headed in the direction he pointed. The trail was narrow and surrounded by dense trees, making the atmosphere even more oppressive. As I walked, the sound of my steps seemed to echo, increasing the feeling that I was being watched. After a few minutes, I saw something shiny on the ground. I approached and saw Lucas' phone, with the screen cracked and the casing scratched. Panic started to take hold of me. I picked up the phone and kept walking, calling his name. Then I heard a faint groan coming from a nearby bush. I approached slowly and, with my heart racing, pushed the branches aside. There was Lucas, lying on the ground, his face pale and a look of terror in his eyes. He was without his wallet, and his phone seemed to have been thrown there after the fall. "El Lucas, what happened?" I asked, trying to keep him conscious. He opened his eyes slowly and, with difficulty, began to speak. "The seller, he seemed nice at first, but then he suggested we go to a quieter place to test the bike." Lucas explained, his voice trembling. "When we got here, 2 men appeared, armed. They surrounded me and took everything: my wallet, phone, even the bike." The feeling of helplessness overwhelmed me. How could I have let this happen? We needed to get out of there immediately. "Let's go. I'll help you get up," I said, trying to sound confident. With great effort, I managed to get Lucas on his feet and supported him as we walked back to the main trail. My only goal now was to get him out of that scary place and ensure his safety. With Lucas leaning on my shoulder, we walked along the trail with heavy, hurried steps. The twilight cast long shadows, and every noise in the forest seemed amplified, making us constantly look back. My hands were sweating, and my heart beat irregularly, fearing that the robbers were still nearby. Suddenly, we heard branches snapping behind us. I turned quickly but saw nothing but the shadows of the trees dancing in the wind. "Come on, Lucas, we need to get out of here fast," I murmured, trying to disguise the panic in my voice. Lucas just nodded, fear clearly etched on his face. With every step, the park's exit seemed further away. That's when we saw 2 figures in the distance, approaching quickly. My heart froze. "Quick, Lucas, we have to hide," I whispered, pulling him behind a large oak tree. The figures came closer, and my breath caught in my throat. I recognized one of the men. It was the bike seller. The 2 were talking in low voices, but we could hear fragments of their conversation. They were checking if anyone had followed Lucas, worried about the possibility of witnesses. I squeezed Lucas's hand, pressing it to keep him calm. After a few minutes, which felt like hours, the men finally walked away, following the trail in the opposite direction. Only then did we dare to leave our hiding place. When we finally reached the park entrance, night had already fallen completely. With difficulty, I managed to call a taxi and took Lucas straight home. He was visibly shaken but happy to be safe. Once home, we immediately called the police. Lucas reported the incident in detail, and I provided all the information I had. The officers promised to investigate, but deep down, we both knew the chances of recovering the belongings or finding the thieves were slim. The following days were difficult. Lucas had constant nightmares, reliving the terror of that night. I tried to be by his side, offering support and ensuring he wasn't alone. Despite all the police's efforts, the thieves were never found. Lucas's case became another forgotten file in the city's pile of unsolved crimes. Lucas, however, learned a hard lesson about trusting strangers and the dangers that can lurk in seemingly innocent online transactions. And I, continued to be the cautious friend, always reminding him and myself that the world can be a dangerous place, even in the most common situations. In 2015, I was going through a complicated phase in my life. After losing my stable job, saving money became a priority. To make matters worse, my old car finally gave up, leaving me without transportation and with few options. Every penny counted, and I urgently needed a car to accept a new job offer I had just landed. This is how I began my desperate search for a used car on Craigslist. I spent hours scouring ads, comparing prices, and trying to identify a good deal. It was during one of these searches that I came across something that seemed too good to be true. A sedan in perfect condition with low mileage for a price well below the market rate. The ad had detailed photos and a convincing description. Despite being naturally cautious, the combination of need and temptation won out. I contacted the seller immediately. His name was Oliver, and he seemed friendly and helpful on the phone. He explained that he was selling the car because he was moving abroad urgently. He suggested we meet in a more remote part of town so I could see the car without interruptions. I hesitated for a moment, but need and the irresistible offer convinced me. We arranged to meet the following weekend on a quiet rural road. As the meeting day approached, I couldn't shake a slight feeling of unease. However, I attributed this to the natural nerves of making a big purchase and went ahead with my plans. Little did I know that this decision would put me in one of the most terrifying moments of my life. The day arrived, and I was more anxious than ever. I double-checked the address on Google Maps before leaving, making sure I knew exactly where to find Oliver. I borrowed a friend's car, somewhat reluctant to tell him where I was going, but I ended up briefly mentioning my destination, just as a precaution. The rural road was exactly as I expected, deserted and flanked by tall trees that blocked out the sky. After a few minutes driving down that isolated path, I spotted the advertised car parked by the roadside. It looked as good as in the photos, if not better. Oliver was there, along with another man he introduced as his brother, John. We chatted briefly about the car, and I made a superficial inspection. Everything seemed to be in order. However, when I got into the car to take it for a test drive, I felt an uncomfortable shiver down my spine. Something didn't feel right. I tried to ignore the feeling and continue with the test drive, but John's strange look made me even more nervous. When I returned to the starting point, Oliver and John exchanged a quick look I couldn't decipher. It was then that I noticed movement in the forest beside the road. Two armed men emerged from the trees, approaching us quickly. My heart raced, and a wave of panic washed over me. Before I could react, one of the men pushed me against the car, while the other began searching my pockets. The confusion and fear left me paralyzed for a moment, but I managed to gather enough courage to grab my phone and, discreetly, send my location to my friend. I only managed to hit send before the phone was ripped from my hands. Oliver and John watched the scene with a disturbingly calm demeanor. The men forced me into the car, now with a gun pointed at my head. I was surrounded with no way out and completely at the mercy of those men. The fear and despair were overwhelming, but a small spark of hope resided in the fact that my location had been sent. As they drove me to an unknown destination, I couldn't help but think about the stories I'd heard about kidnappings and murders. The reality of being trapped in one of those situations was much worse than anything I could have imagined. Each minute felt like an eternity, and the tension in the air was palpable. The car drove down the deserted road, taking me further away from any sign of civilization. The silence inside the vehicle was oppressive, broken only by the muffled sound of the engine and the heavy breathing of the men surrounding me. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and my mind spun in a spiral of terror and despair. After what felt like an eternity, We arrived at an abandoned shed in the middle of nowhere. I was dragged out of the car and pushed inside the dark building. The smell of mold and rust permeated the air, adding to the horror that consumed me. I was tied to a chair and left there, while Oliver and John spoke quietly with the other two men. My heart pounded in my chest, and I desperately tried to think of a way to escape. The distant sound of an approaching engine made my heart leap, but hope was quickly crushed when I saw it was just another accomplice arriving. Time seemed to crawl, each second an eternity as I waited for the worst. Suddenly, the sound of sirens in the distance cut through the air, followed by the flashing red and blue lights. My heart leapt with hope, but fear was still palpable. The criminals panicked, arguing heatedly about what to do. One of the men pulled out a gun and pointed it at me, the wild look in his eyes telling me he was ready to end it all right there. Time seemed to freeze as the shed door was broken down, and heavily armed police officers stormed in, shouting orders for the criminals to drop their weapons. There was a moment of deadly tension, followed by an explosion of action. The criminals were quickly subdued, and I was freed from my restraints, my legs so weak I nearly fainted from relief. I was taken outside, where the fresh air and sunlight seemed surreal after the nightmare I had just lived through. One of the police officers told me that my friend had received my message and alerted the authorities. The speed with which they acted was crucial to my rescue. Oliver and John, along with their accomplices, were handcuffed and taken away, their expressions marked by disdain and defeat. I stood there, trembling and shaken, but incredibly grateful to be alive. That experience taught me a harsh lesson about the dangers that can hide in the shadows of everyday life. I returned home with a new perspective on caution and trust, and with the certainty that I would never accept an offer too good to be true without thoroughly checking every detail. That terrifying experience stayed etched in my memory, a constant reminder of how a moment of carelessness can turn into a real nightmare. Life eventually returned to normal, but the shadow of that day always follows me, a ghost reminding me to remain vigilant and aware of the dangers lurking where least expected. I was browsing Craiglist when I came across an ad that immediately caught my attention. "Free dog," said the title, accompanied by several photos of an adorable golden retriever with bright eyes and a friendly expression. The promises that the dog was docile and well-behaved only increased my enthusiasm. I had always wanted a canine companion, and there was my chance. I decided to respond to the ad without hesitation. The response was quick. A person named Landon explained that, for personal reasons, he urgently needed to get rid of the dog. He insisted that I come to pick him up that very night. Although the urgency seemed a bit strange, the possibility of finally having a dog was irresistible. When I asked about the address, Landon sent me the location of a house a bit away from the city center. It was an area I didn't know very well, but that didn't dampen my excitement. I entered the address into the GPS and set off toward what I hoped would be one of the best decisions of my life. As I drove, I thought about all the plans I had for my new companion. Walks in the park, long city strolls, and lazy afternoons on the couch. The road became increasingly deserted, and the city lights began to disappear in the rearview mirror. Upon arriving at the destination, the first thing I noticed was the absolute silence. The house stood there, old and worn, almost as if it had been abandoned for years. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just an impression, or perhaps Landon had recently inherited the house. I looked around, trying to find any sign of life. That's when I saw the dog tied to a tree in the yard. He wagged his tail happily, seemingly oblivious to anything strange. I got out of the car with a mix of nervousness and excitement. "Landon!" I called out, hoping someone would come to meet me. Nothing. just the sound of the wind passing through the surrounding trees. I took a few hesitant steps toward the dog, trying not to let the nervousness overcome me. That golden retriever seemed so innocent and cheerful, as if nothing was wrong. His comforting presence made me forget, for a brief moment, the discomfort the dilapidated house caused me. "Hi, buddy," I murmured, kneeling to pet his head. He wagged his tail even faster, approaching for more affection. "You really are as sweet as they said." I stood up and looked around again. The silence remained strange. I decided it was best to enter the house and look for Landon. Maybe he was waiting inside, busy with something. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I pushed it lightly, and it opened with a creak that seemed to echo in my ears. The living room was completely dark, except for the faint light coming through the dusty windows. I called out for Landon again, but all I heard was the muffled sound of my own footsteps. "Excuse me, Landon? I'm here to pick up the dog." My voice sounded strange and out of place in that environment. That's when I felt a chill down my spine. An instinctive sense told me something was terribly wrong. Maybe I should have listened to that feeling, but the idea of leaving the dog behind made me move forward. I saw a faint light coming from a corridor and decided to walk toward it. I reached a small kitchen where the light from a lamp barely illuminated the room. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink, and a chair was overturned on the floor. The atmosphere was oppressive, and I felt like I was being watched. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly but saw nothing. My breathing was rapid and shallow, and my heart beat like a drum. I decided it was better to leave immediately. As I made my way back to the living room, I heard heavy footsteps coming from upstairs. Before I could react, a deep, threatening voice echoed through the house. "I said to come alone." Landon's voice sounded different, cold and calculated. I felt a cold shiver down my spine and started running toward the door, but before I could reach it, I felt a strong blow to the head, and everything went dark. I woke up with a sharp pain in my head, my hands and feet tied with rough ropes. I was on the cold, dirty floor of the living room. The golden retriever was no longer there, and the house seemed even more sinister. I tried to free myself, but the ropes were too tight. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, revealing 3 figures standing around me, all wearing grotesque masks. "Let the fun begin," a distorted voice said, and one of the figures stepped forward, holding a wooden bat. I felt the first blow to my ribs, a sharp pain that made me scream. They laughed, the sound echoing in my mind like a nightmare. I was terrified, helpless, at the mercy of those monsters. The next few minutes were a blur of pain, desperation, and an overwhelming desire to survive. They searched me, took my phone, my wallet, and even the car keys. With each blow, I felt my hope fading. But then, I heard a noise outside, distant sirens, but approaching quickly. The attackers heard it too and panicked. One of them muttered something about getting out of here, and within seconds, they disappeared through the back door, taking everything they had managed to steal. Somehow, I managed to crawl to the entrance, my body aching with every movement. I saw the siren lights getting closer, and with my last strength, I shouted for help. The police arrived, and everything after that was a blur. I was taken to the hospital where my injuries were treated. I told the police everything, describing the fake ad, the meeting, and the attack. They promised to investigate, but I knew it might take time. That incident changed my life. My trust in people was shattered, and I could no longer feel safe. What should have been a joyful encounter with a new 4-legged friend turned into my worst nightmare. Even though I survived, the physical and emotional scars would remain forever. And every time I saw an ad for a free dog on the internet, a shiver disturbed me. I would never be the same again. Finally, summer vacation had arrived, bringing with it the promise of freedom and new experiences. My name is Julian, and as a university student, this was my chance to live on my own for the first time. No more messy roommates or crowded dorms. I was determined to find a place of my own. I started my search on Craiglist, where I could find affordable offers. Browsing through the ads, I came across one that seemed perfect. Furnished apartment, excellent location, unbeatable price. The price was incredibly low, almost unbelievable, but curiosity and excitement outweighed any suspicion. I could already see myself decorating the place, inviting friends over, and enjoying my newfound independence. I wasted no time and sent a message to the advertiser, a woman named Clara. She responded quickly, suggesting a visit in the late afternoon. Her promptness gave me confidence. Perhaps I had really found a great deal. On the appointed day, the sun was shining brightly, and I couldn't contain my enthusiasm. I left home early, following the directions to the apartment. I arrived at the address, an old but well-maintained building, in a relatively quiet area. Clara was waiting at the door, a middle-aged woman with a welcoming smile. She greeted me warmly and invited me inside. I could hardly wait to see my potential new home. As soon as I entered, I felt a wave of strangeness. The apartment was completely empty, without any sign of furniture. My expectations deflated a bit, but Clara didn't seem to notice my disappointment. "We are renovating the apartment, which is why it is empty now, but we can provide the furniture as soon as you decide to stay," she said with a smile that now seemed a little forced. She closed the door behind me, and the sound of the lock clicking was alarmingly loud in the silence of the apartment. I tried to shake off the discomfort, attributing it to the natural nervousness of being in a new place with a stranger. Clara began asking questions. Initially, they were typical, where I studied what my hobbies were, but quickly the tone changed. "Do you often have visitors? Do you have family nearby? Does anyone know you are here?" she asked, her voice loaded with intrusive curiosity. My instinct screamed for me to leave. Forcing a smile, I answered with what I hoped was a mix of truths and harmless lies, trying not to show my discomfort. The apartment's atmosphere seemed increasingly oppressive, and Clara began to close the distance between us. "You seem like the type of person who likes privacy, don't you?" she said, her eyes fixed on mine. "This place is perfect for that. No one bothers you, no one asks questions." My nerves were on edge. I had to get out of there. "I just remembered I have an appointment," I lied, trying to sound casual as I took a step back. "Could we reschedule for another day?" Clara's smile disappeared, and her gaze turned icy. "You just got here, why the rush? Stay a little longer," she insisted, blocking my exit. Feeling the urgency increase, I made a quick decision. "Sorry, I really need to go now," I said firmly, moving abruptly towards the door. To my surprise, the key was still in the lock. With a swift motion, I turned the key, unlocked the door, and opened it, feeling the fresh air from the hallway wrap around me like a saving embrace. Clara took a step back, her expression a mixture of anger and surprise. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Julian," she said, her voice now cold and distant. I quickly left without looking back, my heart racing uncontrollably. Once outside the building, I took a deep breath and decided that my next step would be to go to the police. Something was terribly wrong with that place, and I couldn't let it slide. I arrived at the police station still shaken but determined. I reported everything that had happened to the officer on duty, who listened attentively. They promised to investigate and thanked me for reporting the situation. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They had discovered that the apartment was a trap used by criminals to lure and rob unsuspecting people. Clara was just one of the accomplices, part of a larger network that preyed on students and young people looking for cheap housing. The sense of relief was immense, but the experience left a permanent mark on me. I learned to be more cautious and to trust my instincts. That feeling of imminent danger saved me, and I never again underestimated the power of a premonition. In the end, escaping that apartment was a second chance, a lesson to always remember. And as summer vacation continued, I knew I would never forget the day I almost fell into a deadly trap. That ad on Craiglist seemed like the perfect answer to my problems. Newly graduated and in my first job, I desperately needed a cheap car to get to work. My salary was nothing to boast about, and to be honest, I could barely make ends meet. Finding an affordable car was a priority. I spent nights browsing Craigslist, jumping from one ad to another until something caught my eye. A 2002 Honda Civic, listed for a ridiculously low price. The photos showed a car in good condition, without any apparent major damage. The price was so good it seemed suspicious, but my need outweighed any initial distrust. I sent a message to the seller immediately, and to my surprise, he replied quickly. "We can meet tomorrow at noon in the supermarket parking lot downtown," he suggested. It seemed reasonable. A public, busy place with less chance of something going wrong. The next day, I woke up with a mix of anxiety and excitement. I took the bus to downtown, imagining all the possibilities. What if the car has some hidden defect? I thought, but what if it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a stroke of luck that I desperately needed? I arrived at the parking lot a little before noon, and after a few minutes of waiting, I spotted the Honda Civic parked in a corner. A middle-aged man with an ordinary appearance waved at me. "You must be Marcos," he said with a smile. "I'm William." He handed me the keys and invited me to inspect the car. The engine seemed in good condition, and the mileage was low for a car of that age. After a quick spin around the block, I decided it was a good purchase. The price was unbeatable, and from what I could see, the car was in great shape. I paid William in cash as agreed, and he handed me the car documents. With a sense of relief and a bit of pride, I got into my new car and drove home. Little did I know that this would be the last time I felt peace for a long time. The first few days with the car were uneventful. It was a wonderful feeling to finally have my own vehicle. I no longer depended on public transportation to get to work, and it gave me a certain freedom I hadn't felt in years. Everything seemed to be going well until things started to get strange. On the third night after the purchase, as I was leaving work, I noticed a black car parked across the street. It wasn't there in the morning, and somehow it seemed out of place. I didn't pay much attention to it at the moment, but when I started the engine and began driving home, I realized the car was following me. "It's just a coincidence," I thought, trying to calm my nerves. I turned down a few side streets, and the car disappeared. Feeling a mix of relief and paranoia, I continued on my way. However, the following days were marked by more similar incidents. Different cars, but always following me. The situation began to affect my sleep. I found myself awake in the middle of the night, hearing noises outside. My mind created dark and terrifying scenarios. Maybe the car has some problem I didn't notice. I convinced myself, trying to rationalize the growing fear. That's when I decided to investigate the history of the Honda Civic. I took a day off and went to a trusted garage. I explained my situation to the mechanic, an old family friend named Josh. He agreed to do a full inspection and check for any anomalies. At the end of the day, Josh called me back to the garage. His face was pale and he seemed nervous. "Marcos, I think you need to see this," he said, pointing to a small hidden compartment in the trunk. Inside, There were traces of dried blood and some mysterious documents. "This is not good," I murmured, feeling a chill down my spine. The documents were records of some shady transaction, with names and numbers that didn't make sense to me. Josh looked at me seriously. "This car was used in some sort of crime, Marcos. You need to go to the police." But the idea of involving the police terrified me. What if I was accused of something? I decided to investigate on my own before taking any drastic steps. Returning home, I began to search online for unsolved crimes in the area. Soon I found news of a violent robbery followed by a murder. The descriptions matched what I had found in the car. That night, as I tried to process everything, I noticed I was being watched again. Two men were standing on the corner of my street, talking quietly. My heart raced. They were different from the ones I had seen before, but the sense of danger was the same. I locked all the doors and windows, desperately trying to think of an escape. I was trapped in a nightmare, all because of that damn car. What started as a solution to my problems now seemed to be the beginning of something much, much worse. The following days were a blur of fear and paranoia. Every time I left the house, I felt eyes following me. The same men appeared in different places, always at a distance, always watching me. My instinct screamed for me to flee, but to where and how? My job, my whole life was here. Finally, the decision was made for me. One night, after getting home and locking the door, I heard a soft knock. I looked through the peephole and saw two men, different from the previous ones but equally threatening. "Marcos, we know you're there. We need to talk about the car," one of them said, his voice calm and sinister. My heart nearly stopped. How did they know my name? How did they know where I lived? Without wasting any time, I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying not to make noise. "There are two men trying to get into my house," I whispered, my voice trembling. The operator assured me that a patrol was on its way, but every second felt like an eternity. The knocks on the door became more insistent. I moved back, trying to think of a way to escape. The car. Maybe I could get away before they broke in. I ran to the garage, my hands shaking as I opened the car door. Before starting the engine, a figure appeared at the driver's window, pounding on the glass with force. I screamed, started the car, and sped down the street, breaking through the garage door. I drove aimlessly, trying to shake them off, but soon I saw the headlights of a car in my rearview mirror. They were following me. I tried to stay calm, swerving through unknown streets, but the panic grew with every moment. Every attempt to lose them seemed futile. They always found a way to catch up. Finally, I spotted a gas station and made a desperate decision. I pulled in quickly and ran inside, yelling for the attendant to call the police. The men followed my car and parked, but hesitated when they saw me inside the well-lit station with cameras everywhere. While waiting for the police, I kept my eyes on the men, who now seemed to be debating their next move. A few minutes later, a patrol car arrived, and the men disappeared into the night before the officers could catch them. I told the police everything, handed over the documents I found in the car, and waited for answers. The following days were filled with intense investigation. The police confirmed my suspicions. The car had been involved in a brutal crime, and the men were chasing me to recover something they believed I had. They found nothing concrete but advised me to change addresses and, if possible, sell the car immediately. I did exactly that. I abandoned my apartment and moved in with a friend in another city. I sold the car to a junkyard for a ridiculous price, but the sense of relief was worth every penny. The experience left deep marks, and I still wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to see those sinister eyes watching me. I may never uncover all the details of that crime, but one thing is certain. Sometimes the cheap comes out very expensive. and I'll never buy a car on Craigslist again. It was a cloudy Tuesday when I decided, once again, to advertise my babysitting services on Craigslist. I was in my last semester of college, and money was getting tight. With inflation rising and bills piling up, the hourly rates offered for childcare were a blessing. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved to neighbors every morning. It was a relief, especially after a whole day of classes and intense studying. It wasn't the first time I used Craigslist to find work, and so far, my experiences had been positive. That afternoon, while sipping coffee to ward off fatigue, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a woman named Mary. The subject line, "Urgent, babysitter needed tonight," immediately caught my attention. "Hi, my name is Mary and I'm desperately in need of a babysitter for tonight. My son, Noah, is 5 years old and I need to go out for an emergency. Can you help? I'm willing to pay extra." The urgency in the message was palpable, and my empathetic side took over. I quickly replied, confirming my availability. Less than an hour later, Mary arrived at my house to discuss the details. She seemed exhausted and tense, with deep dark circles under her eyes and the expression of someone who hadn't slept in days. I tried to reassure her, ensuring Noah would be in good hands. After a few quick instructions, Mary thanked me profusely and left, leaving Noah with me. As I played with Noah, I couldn't help but notice how sweet and obedient he was, making my job even easier. However, something about Mary's rush and nervousness wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to push these thoughts aside, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. As the night progressed, my unease only grew. And then, shortly after 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It was Mary, back earlier than I expected, with a weak excuse about having forgotten something important. She entered quickly, grabbed some random item, and left again, insisting that I keep the front door unlocked. That left me uncomfortable, but I followed her instructions. Only later would I realize that this decision could have been a fatal mistake. Mary had left again, leaving behind a trail of cheap perfume and unease in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I tried to ignore these thoughts, distracting myself with Noah, who fortunately didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. Around 11 o'clock, I began to hear strange noises coming from outside the house. Initially, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me due to nervousness. However, the sounds persisted, a soft scraping, almost imperceptible, but constant. I got up carefully and went to the front door, trying not to make noise to avoid alarming Noah. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. I decided to lock the door, disobeying Mary's order. Noah's safety was my priority. Minutes later, the doorbell rang again. It was Mary. She seemed even more anxious than before and insisted I leave the door unlocked again. When I asked why, she only mumbled something about forgetting her keys again and left hurriedly. With a knot in my stomach, I obeyed but remained alert. As soon as Mary left, I locked the door again. The tension in the air was palpable, and my senses were on high alert. About half an hour later, I heard the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen. I picked up Noah, my heart beating like a drum, and ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I called the police, whispering the information while trying to stay calm. On the other end of the line, the operator assured me that a patrol car was on its way. While we waited, I heard heavy footsteps through the house. Someone was inside. I held Noah closer, trying to muffle the sound of his heavy breathing. The fear was suffocating, and every second felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right in front of the bedroom door. I heard a sound of metal scraping against the wood, as if someone were trying to open the door with a tool. My body trembled uncontrollably, and I knew that if the police didn't arrive soon, we would be in serious danger. Time seemed to crawl, but finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The sound of footsteps moved away quickly, followed by the noise of doors slamming and people running. Within minutes, firm voices announced the arrival of the police. I opened the bedroom door slowly, still holding Noah, and found heavily armed officers searching the house. I explained the situation as best as I could, still in shock. They escorted us outside, where several patrol cars were parked, and the red and blue lights were flashing intensely. It was then that I saw Mary being led away in handcuffs, along with a man I didn't recognize. The officers explained that she and her accomplice planned to rob us and perhaps something even worse. Her insistence on leaving the door unlocked was part of the plan, but my decision to lock it had delayed everything and given us a chance to escape unharmed. The nightmare was finally over, but the sense of vulnerability and fear still echoed in my mind. I held Noah tightly, grateful that we were safe, but I knew that this experience would stay with me forever. A dark reminder of how quickly the safety of a quiet neighborhood can turn into absolute terror. When the police finally told me it was safe to return to the house, the relief was immediate, but there was still a lingering fear that stayed with me. With Noah still in my arms, I sat on the living room couch as one of the officers approached to ask some routine questions. "What made you decide to lock the door?" he asked, jotting down notes. I explained about the sense of distrust I had from the start, the repeated visits from Mary, and the strange sounds. He nodded, seeming to understand perfectly. "Your intuition probably saved your life and the boys. They were armed." That made my heart stop for a moment. The idea that we could have been attacked with weapons made the terror seem even more real. As the officer continued his notes, another officer came to speak with me, explaining more details of the case. Mary and her accomplice had planned a robbery, but things could have escalated to violence. She mentioned that preliminary investigations showed that Mary had a history of similar crimes but had never been caught. The situation started to become clearer. Mary wasn't a desperate mother, but a criminal using her son as bait. I looked at Noah, who was now sleeping soundly in my arms, innocent of everything that had happened. Knowing that he was also a victim filled me with sadness and anger. Finally, the night began to come to an end. The police took Mary and her accomplice away, and I was left to process what had happened. After ensuring that Noah was comfortable and safe, I called his real parents, who were on their way to pick him up. When they arrived, there were many thanks and tears. I told them everything that had happened, and their relief at finding Noah safe and sound was palpable. We promised to keep in touch, and they insisted on rewarding me, but for me, the greatest reward was knowing that Noah was okay. With dawn breaking, I finally lay down in bed, but sleep seemed impossible. Every sound in the house made my heart race, and the memories of the previous night returned in terrifying flashes. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a restless sleep. In the following days, the news of the incident spread throughout the community. I received many messages of support and thanks, but I also had to deal with the traumatic memories that kept resurfacing. Returning to Craiglist to look for more babysitting jobs was out of the question. The experience changed me in ways I was just beginning to understand. Distrust became a constant shadow, and my perception of my neighborhood's safety was forever altered. However, I also gained a strength and resilience I never knew I had. Remembering the night of terror with Mary still gives me chills, but it also serves as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage and intuition can be the thin line between life and death.